Greetings, my name's Guy Dauncey, and this is the show Change the World, where I like to discuss the world, the universe, the life, and how we make a difference with people who share my love of nature, my passion for life, my joy in progressive thinking. And my guest today is Tracey Saxby. Tracey is a marine scientist, an activist, and a visionary change maker. She's the co-founder of the executive director of My Sea to Sky on the Sunshine Coast. But before she got there, back in 2007, she kickstarted the grassroots movement to reduce plastic bag use across Canada when she proposed that Rossland should be the first plastic bag-free community in Canada. And within a year, Rosslanders, as they call themselves, had voluntarily reduced their use of plastic bags by a phenomenal 75%. And that led to the movement taking off across Canada. In 2014, moving to the Sunshine Coast, she picks up a megaphone to inspire thousands of people to defend, protect, and restore Howe Sound. And when she's not being a political change maker and a social environmental change maker, she's involved skiing, kiteboarding, rock climbing, singing, God, you name it. There we go. So welcome to the show, Tracey.
Thank you, Guy. It's a pleasure to be here.
So tell me, when you first came to Howe Sound, what inspired you to sort of say we need an organization called My Sea to Sky?
Oh, well, that came many years later. So I first came to Howe Sound in 2001 on a rock climbing / skiing trip with my partner from Australia. And we both fell in love with this area. It is one of the most spectacular places that I have ever seen, and I've had the privilege of traveling quite a bit. So we didn't intend to stay, but that's essentially what happened. Is we came on a trip and we never left.
I think that I live on Vancouver Island, and that applies to a lot of us over here as well, right?
Yeah, it truly is an incredible part of the world to live.
Yeah. And so I know that you've gotten involved both in local Howe Sound protection stuff and in global climate emergency stuff. Which one do you want to talk about first?
Oh. So, I mean, I came into activism, I'm going to say quite late. So when I first proposed that Rossland should be plastic bag free, I was in my late 20s. But I was at a point in my life where I felt a lot of despair around climate change. And so just to center that, I first learned about climate change when I was 11, in 1988. And at the time, I thought that the adults were going to solve this problem, just like they had solved the problem with the hole in the ozone layer. And it very quickly became apparent that they didn't. And so growing up in Australia and growing up snorkeling on the coral reefs in Australia, I witnessed one of the first global coral bleaching events. And that's what I studied in university. And so most of my adult life, I have been concerned about climate change and not really knowing what I could do as an individual to make a difference or to be part of the change that needed to happen.
Yeah.
And so with the plastic bag campaign, where I came to for that was it was something that I felt very passionate about. I had also grown up in Australia doing cleanups of the beach with my mum and dad and with family friends. Yeah. So picking up litter was a very easy way, I guess, to get led into a form of activism. So with the plastic bag campaign, it was something to me that was a very simple decision that people could make. And so when I first proposed that, it was in part a response to the despair that I felt and the lack of power that I felt as an individual, as well as the intention of trying to inspire many, many other people to take action and to suggest a potential course for action. Because not only, I mean, there were some criticisms of the plastic bag reduction campaign in the sense that, it's not the individual's problem and we're putting all of this responsibility on the individual when what we really need is policy to make these changes. Yeah. But that takes time, and that's not my understanding of how government works. And this plastic bag campaign is a perfect example. So because we started this massive grassroots movement that sparked across Canada, because we built all of this momentum, it was 15 years later that the provincial and federal governments finally started banning single-use plastics. It took 15 years from starting the campaign to seeing the policy result. And that is partly because politicians don't lead, they follow. So we're trying to now do the same thing with more impactful climate actions. But I do also want to acknowledge that the plastic bag campaign wasn't just a campaign about plastic bags. It was intended to spark a conversation about overconsumption and how the Western world is over-consuming everything. And it did that. It did that very successfully.
Yeah, so it's interesting. Greta Thunberg, she around age 8, 11, sort of started reading about the climate crisis and felt the same as you, like, oh my God, oh my God. And I assume the adults are doing something. And it was when she learned they weren't, she said, well, what am I going to do? I'll sit down and have a little mini strike, just me, alone, herself, right? So these small actions, they have great big ripples, you know. And now it's becoming accepted. Yeah, we can't go on having endless plastic bags and all the other, now it's the microplastics in the ocean and all the other stuff in the ocean. So I think, but a lot of people feel a lack of confidence and hope when it comes to the bigger picture change. And they say, well, we're doing what we can, but the big industries are still pumping out the plastic and still doing all this sort of stuff. So then as we become adults, we have to have the courage to take on those really big industries, right?
Yeah, and that's partly, I guess, the next step in my activism was doing that. So in Squamish, there is a new fracked gas export facility proposed. It's called Woodfibre LNG. Woodfibre because that's the name of the old pulp mill site where the project is proposed, and LNG stands for liquefied natural gas. Except that it's not really natural gas at all. It's going to rely on frack gas from northern BC. So when that project was first proposed in 2013, so almost 2014, 7 years later, 7 years after I did or started the plastic bag campaign, initially I thought it was a good idea because Squamish had lost a lot of its industry, and I knew that local community members were hurting and that, you know, jobs, everybody talks about jobs, we need jobs. But the more I learned about this particular project, Woodfibre LNG, the more I quickly came to recognize that this new fossil fuel infrastructure was going to have devastating impacts on our environment, on our climate, on our community, on human health and safety. And that started another organization called My Sea to Sky. And I co-founded that with a number of other concerned citizens in Squamish. And so that has been where I have been directing a lot of my energy for the last 9 years now, trying to stop this new fossil fuel infrastructure.
Yeah, just to clarify here, so when we talk about natural gas, it is fossil fuel. It's just no more natural than coal or oil, which are kind of natural in some ways, but they're a fossil fuel. They're the primary cause of the climate crisis.
Exactly.
And that the all new natural fossil gas in BC is coming from fracking, and fracking involves a process of little mini underground explosions, which releases methane. And natural gas, natural gas is methane. That's what it is, CH4. And methane as a molecule over a 20-year period traps 84 times more heat than carbon dioxide. So it's a really big component of the climate crisis. And as I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but the big pitch that the LNG industry has made is that if we export LNG to China, they'll use it to replace coal and stuff like that, and it'll reduce our climate impact. But it's just as bad as coal when you include all the methane emissions. It's a primary cause of the climate crisis.
There is fugitive methane at every step of the process, and it's not clear that burning LNG is going to be any better for the climate than burning coal. And that's because there is fugitive methane escaping at the fracking well, along the pipeline routes, at the compressor stations. As you liquefy the natural gas, then there's huge amounts of energy required to ship the gas to the final customer. Then they regasify it, which requires even more energy. And then finally, they burn the gas. So when you take all of that into consideration, there's projections that show that LNG is worse than burning coal. So it's not a climate solution, and it shouldn't be considered a climate solution.
What this makes me think is that LNG is the last gasp of the fossil fuel industry.
Yes and no. There's other things that are coming up that are making me just as concerned. Blue hydrogen is yet another last gasp of the fossil fuel industry, because what they're proposing to do there is to take fat gas, burn all that energy so that they could create this hydrogen that they're then going to market as clean. And that's another last gasp of the fossil fuel industry. But yes, the fossil fuel industry is doing everything it can right now to continue fracking, to continue extraction and export of fossil fuels in Canada.
So am I right in understanding that British Columbia has set some core goals to tackle the climate crisis, because they're all on board, there is a climate crisis, and they're aiming towards, I think, a 40% reduction in our emissions by 2030. How does the expansion of liquefied fossil gas fit into the reduction in climate emissions?
Well, the short answer is that it doesn't. There's really no way that the province can have its cake and eat it too in this case. Even just one of these new LNG export facilities is going to undermine our ability to hit our climate targets. And we've got several LNG export facilities proposed up and down the coast. LNG Canada phase 1 and then phase 2. Wood fibre LNG is poised to begin construction. And then there's a number of other facilities, Tilbury LNG in Vancouver. There's all these different projects that are trying to get up and running.
And the Coastal GasLink pipeline, which is the one going through the traditional territories of the Wet'suwet'en people, who are so up in arms to say, you know, we didn't approve this, we haven't signed off on this, we don't want this, right?
Yeah, and that particular pipeline has had so many environmental infractions. They are trying to cut costs, and they're cutting corners in a rush to get the gas to market. And the reality is that there's almost a gold rush mentality happening right now. We had very successfully stopped wood fibre LNG. It was intended to begin construction in 2015, and the project was kind of dead. It was still sticking around, but it was pretty much dead. And then Russia invaded Ukraine, and the fossil fuel industry said, oh, this is an opportune moment for us. We're going to ask the government for more subsidies so that we can build all of these new fossil fuel infrastructure, get the taxpayers to pay for it, and then we're going to profit hugely. And that to me is kind of crazy, because these fossil fuel companies are some of the richest corporations on the planet, and they are raking in massive profits right now, and yet they still have their hand out for more money. They want taxpayer subsidies.
Let me change gear. You've got that beautiful poster, as the viewer sees it to the right of you, of Howe Sound. Athol Katsem must be the first Indigenous name for the sound, right?
Yeah, Squamish Nation has 3 names for our Katsem Howe Sound, and this is the one that is commonly in use.
So tell me about the sea lions and the impact of the tankers on the sea lions.
Yeah, so it's interesting what's happening right now. Wood fibre LNG is trying to weaken its environmental regulations related to underwater noise and also water quality. And what they're trying to do is to say, we can't manage underwater noise for pinnipeds and sea lions and other seals. So they want to reduce the management boundary from over 7 kilometers to just 125 meters. It's more than a 98% reduction in the amount of area that they have to manage underwater noise for. And it's just irresponsible, and yet another example of trying to cut costs at the expense of the environment. So the company is claiming that it's not technically or economically viable, but the reality is they just don't want to spend the money to do the right thing.
Yes, so you're a marine scientist, right?
I am.
You know about the way in which the marine sea lions depend on sound waves under the water.
So everything that lives underwater requires sound to
Yeah.
communicate, to hunt, to find food, to reproduce, to escape predators,
So, so,
everything,
so
almost
if we,
everything.
if we were underwater and we had the tanker, it'd be like having this interview and someone going "Brrr" on top of us all the time, or, "Brrr," and we wouldn't be able to talk, right?
Yeah, there's some amazing research that's been done by Kathy Heisey, and she has audio clips of what it sounds like to be pile driving, or even just the sound of what it's like to have a boat going by when an orca or a whale is trying to communicate. And it's the most heartbreaking thing because you hear this beautiful, just kind of lyrical song of the whale, and then all of a sudden you hear this ship noise cut over the top of it. It is really tragic. And I think there's been a lot of recognition in the last couple of decades that noise pollution, and in particular underwater noise pollution, is something that we need to manage. We have a responsibility to manage that.
Yeah. How are local people in Howe Sound and Squamish responding to the whole campaign that My Sea to Sky is doing?
Really well. I mean, there's definitely some division, more in the community of Squamish, I would say. But more than 21,000 people have signed a petition in opposition to the project. We have made wood fiber LNG an election issue for every local, provincial, and federal election in the last 9 years. So there's definitely a lot of support for what we're doing.
Yeah.
And even a lot of the people that used to be supportive of the project, as we have experienced these climate catastrophes in the last few years, they're changing their position. They're starting to recognize that, oh, we really cannot, we don't have any time left to develop new fossil fuel infrastructure like this that will lock in climate pollution for up to 4 decades. We've run out of time, and we need to make that switch to renewables really quickly.
And the great news is that the cost of renewables like solar and wind energy is falling dramatically. And electric car prices hopefully will fall dramatically once the car producers have got over this. Let's squeeze them for all they're worth because there's a waiting list, right? So we don't need fossil fuels anymore.
We really don't need fossil fuels anymore. We really don't. It's just a matter of political will. Even with what all of the fossil fuel companies are doing, like they're falsely claiming that we need Canada's LNG so that we can help solve Europe's gas crisis.
Yeah.
The reality is that by the time any of these projects are up and operational, that gas crisis isn't going to be a crisis anymore because they've already switched to renewables. And that's already been happening. Europe is very rapidly switching to renewables, and nobody's going to want this product by the time these projects are built.
Well, they've seen the danger of being dependent on gas and oil from Russia, so they're having to scramble and accelerate stuff. So we've got about 5-8 minutes left. Over your other shoulder, you've got this poster called Confront the Climate Emergency. And that's the 2022 progress report. So what are you holding here? Tell us about it.
So this is a really exciting campaign. This is a collaboration between organizations and labor unions and faith groups, Indigenous groups, youth groups that have come together, and we wrote an open letter calling on the BC government to confront the climate emergency. And it includes 10 urgent climate actions that we're calling on the government to implement now. When we first released this open letter in late 2021, I think we released it with about 240 signatories to it. It's now been signed by over 540 organizational signatories that represent 2.1 million British Columbians. So this is a really exciting campaign because it identifies some of the biggest impact actions that the BC government can take to confront the climate emergency. And for example, like to invest, like we need the government to put their money where their mouth is. The BC budget is coming up, and we want them to show us that they're serious about the climate crisis by investing in the solutions that we want to see and investing in those jobs that will help us move us and transform our economy, transform our communities in ways that are really quite amazing. Obviously, ending new fossil fuel infrastructure.
We've got time to go through these briefly. Number 3, rapidly wind down fossil fuel production and use. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah. What's number 4 in there?
Number 4 is to end fossil fuel subsidies.
And make the polluters pay. Yeah, why should we use our taxpayers' money when they're raking in such huge profits? Doesn't make any sense.
Example of this right now is LNG Canada is trying to get BC taxpayers to pay to electrify their fossil fuel export facility. So that's going to cost billions of dollars and take years. Not to mention it's going to steal all of the electricity that we need here in BC to electrify everything, to electrify our buildings, to electrify our transportation. If these fossil fuel export companies take all of our electricity, we're not going to have enough left.
So number 5 up here is leave no one behind, which is about supporting workers, as I presume, doing the transition. And it's got a little stamp saying progress, implying the government's making some good progress on this?
Yeah, it's partly supporting fossil fuel workers. So it's not just fossil fuel workers in resource-dependent communities, though. It's Indigenous and remote communities. It's also those people that are most vulnerable to the climate crisis. So, for example, the photograph here is an elderly senior lady. Just recognizing that it's seniors that were left most vulnerable during the latest heat wave.
If you were in an apartment or a house and you didn't have a heat pump or air conditioning, it was terrible during that heat wave event. Just terrible. Yeah.
Well, and I think the count now is 619 people died during that heat wave.
Yeah, and they'll come again. There's going to be more of that stuff, more forest fires, more floods. It's kind of inevitable until we tackle this crisis and make that shift off fossil fuels. What's number 6? 6 is protect and restore nature. Okay, that's total sense. I'm going to flip straight on because we're short of time. Number 7 then?
Number 7 is I'll let you read it.
Invest in local, organic, regenerative agriculture and food systems. Yeah, I mean, globally, our food systems are causing as much as a third of the whole cause of the climate crisis. Yeah. Number 8 is the big one. Accelerate the transition to zero emissions transportation, which is electric vehicles, cycling, transit, car sharing, all that stuff. All makes sense?
I bought an e-bike last year and I am in love. I am riding it everywhere. It's incredible. We did that instead of buying an electric car.
Number 9, accelerate the transition to zero emission buildings, which is basically using passive, super efficient design and heat pumps. Hello?
Heat pumps. Heat pumps are amazing.
And they're amazing. We have a heat pump, and when it's too hot, you just turn it on to cooling, and suddenly you're cool. And what's the final one, number 10?
Tracking and reporting.
Report the progress on these each year. So, and that's got a big thing called fail next to it. So the government is not tracking its progress properly.
Overall, I think the government failed on most of these. I think they made some progress on 4 of them. Hang on, here's the overview.
Okay, yeah. It's hard to read that on the screen. So you give us the highlights of that.
Yeah. So the government did make some progress last year in ending fossil fuel subsidies, the leave no one behind, investing in local, organic, regenerative agriculture and food systems. And then also there's been a big focus on accelerating the transition to zero emission transportation. Yeah. But in everything else, the government got a failing grade. So they have a lot of work to do. And I think there's a real opportunity with the new Premier, David Eby. He has made some very exciting commitments. When he accepted the premiership, in his speech, he said, "We cannot continue to subsidize fossil fuels and expect clean energy to manifest somehow. We cannot continue to expand fossil fuel infrastructure and hit our climate goals. Our legislated climate targets are of significant importance, targets I want our province to hit." So this is really exciting because I think that the Premier has an opportunity to demonstrate his sincerity in,
Yeah.
what he said in his speech. He needs to now make that actions. And that means stopping new fossil fuel infrastructure, not subsidizing fossil fuel infrastructure, and helping to support this transformative change that needs to happen in our communities. It's a really exciting time, and I am hopeful. I am hopeful.
So, we've got a couple of minutes to wind up. It's hope not just for us humans and what's coming down the pipe, but for all the marine creatures. Go back to your marine science background and your love of the ocean. And what does the climate crisis mean for the creatures that are living in the ocean?
So the climate crisis is one of the biggest threats that we have for biodiversity, because our oceans are changing so quickly that the species that live there just can't keep up. And there's a couple of different things that are happening with our oceans. There's ocean acidification. So because we've put so much CO2 into the air, the ocean is essentially acting like a sponge and sucking that all in. But what that's doing is making the water more acidic, which is then affecting the ability of wildlife and everything that lives in the ocean to survive. There's also sea level rise and just warmer temperatures in general. It's really affecting the balance of everything. So just going back to that idea that everything is connected, and when we are changing one factor so rapidly, and that is how much climate pollution we're putting in the air, that has increased so dramatically that we are forcing all of these changes. So all of the cycles are just not able to keep up.
Yes, I grew up with zero education about anything environmental. I was raised in South Wales, and there was chunks of tar on the beach all the time, and we just thought it normal from oil spills. And this new notion of interconnectedness, that we are all interconnected, the sea lions, ourselves, the birds, the mountains. The Snuneymuxw people where I live, they have the elders say, from the mountaintop to the river to the sea, we're all connected. We look after it all, then we'll look after the humans as well. So this has been fabulous. We'll put your website for My Sea to Sky up for viewers to see, and also the website for the climate emergency campaign. And I really thank you for all the great leadership and championing you're doing for nature and for the future generations over there in Howe Sound and in the world as a whole, right? Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Guy. Well, I mean, it's been a real pleasure to work with you on this campaign. You've played a big role in this too. So, yeah, this brings me joy. This brings me hope. And I really do encourage people to take action, whatever that looks like for you, whether it is voting or sending a letter to your MLA or going to talk with your politicians, letting them know what's important to you and getting involved.
Well, thanks, Tracey. So my name's Guy Dauncey. This show has been Change the World. Tune in for more scintillating guests and just creative thinking and positive thinking about the future. We enjoyed all. Thanks very much. Thanks for watching.